In this lecture, we're going to apply the stats to their respective characters. Performing this process will be relatively straightforward. First, we must load the stats from the component. By default, scriptable objects are not available from the scene. We must store them in a game object. In the character's respective controllers, we'll define a variable for storing the file data. Unity allows us to easily store scriptable objects from within a variable. To get started, open the enemy controller file. Under the list of non-serialized variables, define a public variable called stats. Set the type to character stats SO. That's it. By using the class as the type, Unity will add a field that will accept the scriptable object as the value for the variable. Before testing our code, we should throw a warning when a file has not been added. If someone attempts to add a new enemy without applying their stats, this could potentially break our game. Adding a warning can be a great way to prevent unexpected behavior from occurring. In the awake method, add a conditional statement. The condition will be the following: stats equals null. If the stats variable has a null value, this means a file has not been added. Inside the conditional block, add the following message with the debug.log warning method. Game does not have stats. Once again, we're using string interpolation to add the object's name to the message. It'll help us find the enemy without their stats. Let's try adding the enemy stats to our enemies. Switch over to Unity. I'm going to enter prefab edit mode for the stationary enemy. In the inspector, under the enemy controller component, a new field will be available called stats. Typically, we would click the button to select the fields. Instead, let's drag and drop the enemy stats file onto this field. There isn't a difference between the two approaches. I just wanted to mention an alternative solution for adding a file to a field. Dragging a file into the field has the same effect as selecting it from the window. Let's switch over to the patrol prefab. Same as before, let's drag and drop the enemy stats file onto the enemy controller. The next step is to add the stats to the player. I want you to tackle this step as an exercise. Currently, the player does not have an appropriate component for storing their stats. Therefore, create a new component called Player Controller. After doing so, add a field for storing their stats. Lastly, add the component and stats to the player prefab. Pause the video and give it a try. Welcome back. Hopefully, you were able to complete the exercise. If not, let's walk through the solution together. The first step is to create the component. In the scripts/character folder, create a C# file called Player Controller. Next, open this file with Visual Studio Code. Let's quickly clean up the file. Remove the system namespaces. Enter the Player Controller class. Next, create the rpg.character namespace. Lastly, move the class into the namespace. Great, the first step is complete. The next step was to create a field for storing the stats. In the class, define a public variable called stats with the character stats SO class as the type. Next, let's make sure to add a reminder to add stats to the player. In the class, define the awake method. Let's borrow the conditional statement we had in the enemy controller class. So far so good. Everything is coming along great. The last steps are to apply this component to the player prefab. Open this prefab in Unity. Add the player controller to the parent object. Next, add the player stats file to the stats field. Just to ensure everything is working, let's try playing our game. If everything worked, the messages from the awake method should not appear, thus verifying that all enemies and players have stats. Perfect! We've successfully added stats to our characters. In the next lecture, let's begin applying these stats.